The 14th United Nations Crime Congress has convened in the midst of two global pandemics, COVID-19 and the ongoing pandemic of killings perpetrated by organized crime. Assassinations are a global phenomenon. The global initiative's preliminary data on targeted killings shows that more than 1,500 killings ranged across 73 different countries in 2020. In 3/4 of the cases, the victim targets were what we can broadly define as civil society members, such as community leaders, activists, journalists, indigenous peoples. 30% of the cases, the victims belonged to the public sector. 2/3 of the killings happened in the Asian and Americas continent alone. And in 7% of the cases, the main weapon used was a firearm. We bear witness to these assassinations. Assassinations perpetrated by organized criminal groups who use and exploit these violent acts to increase their stranglehold over communities and kill at will those who threaten to challenge the status quo and its corrupt protectors. The Congress' mandate is to focus on crime prevention, criminal justice, and the rule of law. But within the context of these killings, the Congress is convening where prevention is in retreat, justice is not being served, and the rule of law is fatally undermined. Assassinations are a mechanism used by organized crime to achieve their political, economic, and criminal interest. They are also a way of silencing those who take a stand against organized crime, or those whose job is to investigate and end criminal processes. And the fact of this goes way beyond the crime itself. It affects communities and the family of the murderer. The fragile investigations end up in impunity. The global initiative's Assassination Witness campaign puts a spotlight on the issue and calls on the international community to commemorate the lives of the individuals who stood up against crime and to take a stand against targeted killings. On 15 June 2020, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime launched the Assassination Witness campaign. This campaign bears witness to the victims of organized crime, seek for justice, and raise awareness to the fact that everywhere organized crime is killing people. Today we have Mark Shaw, the director of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, to talk about the campaign and why it's important to the Crime Congress. Mark, why is it important to understand and analyze cases of targeted killings by organized crime?
Anna, thank you very much. The campaign is something that we wanted to really highlight an untold story, which is of civil society activists being targeted, threatened, and killed by organized crime. Many people know about individual killings, they are reported, but we wanted to determine the overall extent of what is a huge challenge. And we know from our own grantees, people we support in local communities who are responding to organized crime, about the dangers they face. So this campaign is very, very important to us in that it highlights an area that we don't think there has been much, apart from individual stories which are very traumatic, there's been no real sense of the extent of the problem.
And who are those individuals that are being targeted, Mark?
From the Global Initiative side, we've used the numbers of people killed by organized crime in targeted killings as a way to measure conflict within organized crime, the capacity of organized crime to commit violence and to cause harm within local communities. And there are two broad categories for us. Cases where people are killed by criminal groups, often in turf wars between criminal organizations, for example. And that's important for us as it shows the power of organized crime and that innocent people get caught in the crossfire. But more importantly, that it builds up the capacity for violence within criminal groups, which is often turned against people within civil society. And that's the focus of our campaign, this latter group. People who are targeted by organized crime because they stand up to criminal organizations within their communities. So these two broad categories are linked. Our focus of the campaign is, if you like, on people building resilience who are then targeted by organized crime. But the fact that organized crime develops a capacity for violence in its defense of turf, in its control over, for example, drug markets or other illicit markets, that capacity for violence is then turned onto people who try and oppose the strength and power of organized crime.
And why do you think this campaign fits with the Crime Congress?
I think the Crime Congress is a UN meeting, so it takes place at a very high level. So people are talking about crime prevention and criminal justice, and often it's removed from the realities on the ground. And what we want to do with a campaign like this is to remind people the harm and the cost that criminal activity and organized crime and illicit markets causes to ordinary people. And people pay the ultimate price. They really suffer in local communities. And these are stories that are not told in international fora. These are the forgotten victims of organized crime. But many of them are absolutely heroes. They're heroes to their local community. They have all made conscious decisions to stand up to organized crime, and many of them pay the price. So we want to provide a human face to the challenge. We want to show people who these other people are who have the courage to stand up. And we want to demonstrate that the costs of organized crime are not just something that are contained in a diplomatic setting, a conference hall, but they are very real human costs. So that's the purpose of our campaign.
Thank you, Mark. Assassinations cluster around common drivers, geographical spaces, and particularly groups of people. The Global Initiatives podcast promotes a high-level discussion among civil society members, researchers, experts who are in the front line to protect those vulnerable groups. A group that is a particular risk of being threatened, harassed, and even killed is human rights defenders.
Why are they targeted by organized crime? Well, there are many factors at play. Some are more local, country-specific considerations, and some are more regional or global phenomenon. But ultimately, I suppose, criminal groups target human rights defenders because their human rights work in areas such as migrant rights, land rights, indigenous people's rights, sex workers' rights, are often end up disrupting the economic interests of these criminal groups who are involved in narco trafficking, human smuggling, illegal logging or resource extraction and other illegal businesses. It's also worth noting that defenders are often killed by hired assassins from criminal gangs. So while some of these criminals may not be the intellectual authors of the killings, they carry out the assassinations for monetary gain, which we assume further finances their criminal activities.
Assassinations in Latin America is particularly widespread. Just in 2019, 2/3 of the killings of the defenders took place in the region.
One key factor to understand the killing of human rights defenders in Colombia is the limited state presence in these mostly rural areas. This limited state presence means that social organizations, including what are called neighborhood action committees, Afro-Colombian community councils, and indigenous groups, often play prominent roles in performing tasks typically assigned to local government officials, such as protecting the population or promoting government plans. And this increases the visibility of social organizations' leaders, including human rights defenders, exposing them to very serious risks. This includes the human rights defenders who have been promoting initiatives established under the 2016 peace accord with the FARC guerrillas. For example, many human rights defenders have been killed for supporting or participating in plans to replace coca crops, the raw material of cocaine, with food crops.
There are certain types of defenders that are at particular risk in Mexico. As I mentioned, environmental activists are probably at the top of that list. These are individuals that are openly opposing large-scale development projects and the illegal exploitation of natural resources, which made up about half of the human rights defenders who were killed last year, were individuals involved in these activities. This is linked again to organized criminal groups who have also sought to expand their illicit activities beyond drug trafficking to the production and sale of natural resources, particularly as a means to exert territorial control over parts of Mexico, and obviously for profit. There's a few cases that really illustrate that this year, in January, the environmental activist Homero Gomez Gonzalez, who worked for one of the butterfly reserves in Michoacan, was killed with signs of torture. And I think it's believed that his killing was likely linked to his activity to combat illegal logging in the state of Michoacan, also linked to organized criminal activities in that state. Just 4 days after his death, another conservationist that worked with him was also found killed. Another category of individuals that are at risk are migrant shelter staff. I think in particular because migrant shelters protect migrants themselves from kidnapping and other activities by organized criminal groups who extort migrants for profit, who seek to prey upon this population. So oftentimes, organized criminal groups see migrant shelters and their staff as impacting their profit because they are working to protect this population. I think the last category that's important to highlight are family members of disappeared persons in Mexico who are defending their rights for truth and justice. Many family members have organized into collectives of families searching for justice for their loved ones, but also for other cases. And they are also at extreme risk because many times these collectives of family members search for their loved ones on their own. They're out in the field. They're out in territories that are controlled by organized criminal groups. They're digging through areas that are uncovering things that some people might not want to see uncovered. And they carry out oftentimes their own investigations into what happened to their loved ones because the Mexican government has failed to act in these cases.
But the problem doesn't concentrate only in Colombia or Mexico. It's a global problem that demands a global response. And particular attention should be given to environmental crimes. Most of the killings of defenders take place in the context of exploitation of land and of the natural resources.
What we do know is that from Global Witness's data is that consistently a large number of the victims or land environmental defenders who are attacked and killed, almost 40%, almost consistently year on year, tend to belong to indigenous communities. So Global Witness's data has shown that between 2015 and 2019, over a third of all fatal attacks have specifically targeted indigenous people, despite the fact that they only make up 5% of the world's population.
Indigenous peoples, at least the data that we have in the Philippines, more than 50% of the mining concessions are within the ancestral domains of the indigenous peoples. Corporate plantations are within ancestral domains of indigenous peoples. The two major mega dams that are being pushed by the Duterte government are within the ancestral domains of indigenous peoples. And so it has become an obligation of sorts of the indigenous peoples to defend their lands from all of these onslaughts and from all of these attacks against their ancestral territories.
So few perpetrators of killings of defenders are ever brought to justice, due to the failure of governments to properly investigate or prosecute anyone for these crimes. So we're seeing many authorities turning a blind eye or even actively impeding investigations into these killings. Now, this is principally due to the collusion that we see between corporate and state interests, which are the principal suspects in these murders. This is true, for instance, in the case of the murder of Berta Cáceres, the renowned Honduran activist who was killed by a combination of state and corporate interests.
We share the brave stories of individuals who lost their lives to stand up against organized crime.
On the night of January 16, 2019, two men on a motorbike drilled a BMW through the streets of Accra. A gun was fired at the driver of the car, forcing him to swerve and crash the car into a roadside stop. One of the men then calmly walked up to the BMW and fired 2 more shots at the man behind the wheel. Turning to face the crowd, watching from a distance, he smiled and raised a finger to his lips. The man who was shot and killed that night was journalist Ahmed Hussein Swali Divela. He was just 31 years old.
Ahmed Suave Divela, Daphne Caruana Galizia, Jan Kuciak, Javier Valdez. They were killed for unveiling the truth and giving voice to the voiceless. Journalists like them are becoming targeted by the organized criminal groups they are trying to expose.
The perpetrators are very often criminal actors who are working in concert with corrupt government officials. This happens in many nations throughout the world, and the Committee to Protect Journalists has compiled a database which has shown that people suspected of government officials or others suspected of working with government officials are suspected of more murders of journalists than even murders committed by terrorists or other political groups. So that's the main reason, this nexus of collusion between criminal actors and elected officials, when journalists start to uncover evidence of those ties, that people get murdered.
And in all these cases, assassinations have a tremendous toll in the victims' families and communities.
If families never really speak up, if they never really speak publicly, attaching their names to what they're saying, then these murders will just simply fade away. And no police officers will ever risk pursuing these cases aggressively. Obviously, it's hard for victims, for the family members of victims of assassinations to speak out publicly. The fear is incredible that you feel, but you have to do it because you can't expect other people to find the courage to do that for you if you're not willing to do it yourself. That's a very hard thing for me to say, and it's a very hard thing to be told as the relative of someone who's been murdered, but that's the truth. That often it's the victims who need to find the courage to speak up first, hoping that other people will follow. And in our mother's case, in our country's case, other people did follow, slowly at first, but then more and more started to speak out. And now there's what I hope is a self-sustaining civil society movement for justice for my mother's murder, and also for the crimes that she was investigating, which is hugely important if we're ever to unravel the criminal network that was behind her murder.
Assassinations are a global phenomenon. However, a large proportion of these cases occur in societies where organized crime has a strong presence. Dr. Cecilia Farfán-Méndez is head of security research programs at the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at the UC San Diego. She's co-founder of Mexico Violence Resource Project, a partner from the Global Initiative, and she's a mentor of Global Initiative Resilience Fund Fellowship. Cecilia, you have a large experience in research in criminal governance and violence in the Mexican context and elsewhere. Why do you think organized crime uses assassinations, and how those groups benefit from these assassination cases?
Well, thank you for that introduction. I would say that in the context of Mexico, what we have seen is really two main reasons for why organized crime targets people and assassinates them. And one of them is to really silence the press. So what we have seen over the years, unfortunately, is that about organized crime, in particular coverage that uncovers links between government officials and criminal groups, so high levels of corruption, journalists tend to be targeted. So there is this sense that this needs to be silenced, which also sends a message to other journalists about not covering those news. So on the one hand, there's this need to silence these voices that are exposing corruption. On the other one, I think it also helps them send a strong message about their capabilities and who they are. And so even though sometimes they may not be as powerful as people think they are, the fact that they can carry out an assassination and even more do so with impunity because there's no one who is really going to face the consequences of assassination, I think in some communities also creates this sense that they are everywhere and they can really do a lot of damage and they're more powerful than the state. And so on the one hand, as I said, there's this silencing mechanism that we have seen at play in Mexico, but there's also this, creating this perception that they can, inflict a lot of damage if they want to, and that there's nothing the state can do about it.
As you mentioned a little bit already, what do you think is the impact of those cases in the communities? And what do you think also should be improved and better done to tackle the problem of impunity?
I think what we have seen, and unfortunately, I think these are long-term effects, is that, the extent that we don't have a press that covers, what is happening, that really exposes corruption, it ultimately undermines democratic rule. So it may seem that maybe one journalist getting killed is not necessarily going to undermine democracy as a whole, but over the years, as you see how it has limited the press, I think you can say, well, how is this impacting democratic rule? And I think, unfortunately, in Mexico, but in the Latin American region, this is a question that we're going to have to grapple with in the years to come. I think it also impacts democracy because it's not only, sometimes they're not only targeting journalists, but they're also targeting public servants and those running for office. And I think also creates the question of what is that doing to the quality of the rule of law that we have if people who are in power, can get killed, and those who are running for office could potentially also get killed. What does that mean for democratic rule in Mexico? But as I said, also in the region, I think in terms, I think impunity, it's not only as I mentioned, impunity. And I think what we need to start seeing is really the government bringing, prosecuting some of these high-level cases. And for example, in the assassination witness campaign, Javier Valdez is one of the actors. And to this day, that case really very much remains unresolved in the sense that nobody feels that there has been justice delivered to, family, and really the city of Culiacan and the state of Sinaloa that felt that loss as their own. So to the extent that we don't see that prosecution taking place, those cases really redressing victims, I think, this will continue to be advantageous for criminal groups.
In the years that the Global Initiative has spent monitoring assassinations, we have seen that a large portion of those cases, even the high-profile ones, remain largely unsolved. Where there is impunity, assassinations continue to occur. And this is true for all places where assassinations have been recorded, and reveals one of the biggest challenges behind solving organized crime-related murders: the identification, investigation, and prosecution of the mastermind in these killings. Although the hitman may even be brought to justice, it's far more difficult to pin a charge on those suspected of ordering the murder. Even when suspects are brought before courts, convictions are far and few between. Agnès Callamard, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings, spoke to us last May about why organized crime-related murders go often unsolved and what the international community can do to end impunity.
Many of the people that were profiling in the campaigns knew their lives were under threat, but there were no resources to protect them. What do you think is going wrong here?
Well, many things are going wrong, but the key dimension is the institutionalization of impunity and the demonstration of the inability or the unwillingness of governments to investigate and prosecute. I have gone to places, including in Mexico, where 4 or 5 years after the killing of a journalist by so-called organized gang, the investigation file was 1 or 2 pages long. So the problem begins here. The problem begins with the fact that the police in many places, either because they are corrupt or because they are scared, are not investigating the case. Witnesses are not interviewed and material evidence is not collected, which means that when a case goes to trial, if it goes to trial, there is nothing sufficient there to prosecute. And it doesn't ask too much of our international community to stand up to those assassinations. The most important thing that people can do is speak up and speak out against those murders. It requires a lot of energy and it shouldn't, but we need to speak up and we need to push for those investigations, because when they are successful, they demonstrate and they get rid of the poison that is eating at our society. This is why we need to stand up, and this is why we need to call for proper investigation, for the UN to do far more than they are doing at the moment by establishing the standing instrument to investigate the killings, the assassinations of defenders and journalists around the world. Bringing together the family, the civil society, the international actors, the multilateral organizations, international human rights experts. It is that combination of actors that is also helping in breaking the silence, and in particular breaking the attempt by the organized criminal gangs with the collusion of politicians and corporate actors. Those are come together attempting to silence us or attempting to make us feel that there is nothing we can do. So that is why the UN, the international organization, the regional organizations, whether it's in Europe, in Latin America, or in Africa, they must do everything. And denouncing is good, speaking up is good. Now we need to move to the next level.
The Global Initiative's work on assassination provides a better evidence base for research and builds a foundation for better policy response. The Eastern and Southern Africa Observatory has been collecting data on assassinations since 2015 and is producing a report in Kenya, Mozambique, and South Africa. Ruxana Parker, an analyst at the Global Initiative, has been working closely in the data collection and the production of this report. Ruxana, why should we monitor target killings? What is the impact of those assassinations in the communities?
When we look at South Africa, Kenya, and Mozambique, we find that although homicide statistics are made available in these countries, there's a lack of disaggregated data on targeted killings. Very little is known about contract killings. And given this lacuna, the Global Initiative has generated a database on targeted killings in order to shed light on the criminal economy of targeted hits in the region. We are able to understand better the nature and extent of targeted killings. It threatens the political, economic, and social security of a country. For example, hits related to business disputes and economic outcomes threaten the very notions of fair economic competition. For example, targeted hits in the South African taxi industry. When hits are done to intimidate and create fear in a public place, bystanders often get caught in the crossfire. Socially, hits may affect the victim's immediate community, more so economically if the individual was a breadwinner. Targeted hits also pose a threat to the country's judicial system by fostering a culture of fear and silencing. Assassinations of attorneys, magistrates, prosecutors, judges, and witnesses are likely to result in inaccurate, if any, testimonies. And if we look at political killings, they delegitimize the political process, thereby undermining democracy, especially when political positions are assigned through the violent removal of political rivals. The threat of violence itself also has the potential to limit or eradicate transparency and accountability in cases where journalists or whistleblowers are killed. As I've mentioned, very little is known about contract killings, despite its far-reaching impact. So we therefore require further research to understand and address this. By tracking these incidents, these hits, providing detailed analysis and indicators, and bringing them to the public attention, support is built for policy solutions. And this makes it imperative for us to monitor assassination.
And what are the patterns that have been identified in target killings in each of these countries?
So while the landscape or the context of targeted killings in each of these countries vary, there are also similarities or common clusters of assassination across the countries. For example, political hits are prevalent across all three countries. Between 2015 and 2019, 46% of assassinations in Kenya were political hits. And in Mozambique, 87% of the assassinations were political hits as well, largely influenced by the long-standing history of political violence and tensions between the ruling and opposition parties, namely Frelimo and Renamo. In both Kenya and South Africa as well, we've also discovered that the most popular location for hits is at or close to the victim's home, while in Mozambique, they generally occur away from the victim's home. Firearms were also noted as the most commonly used weapon across the countries. Assassinations by stabbing as well as strangulation were also a predominant feature of organized crime cases in Kenya, while with stabbing being a particularly common method used by youth gangs. For South Africa in particular, last year we've seen that despite the murder rate decreasing in certain parts of the country, there are still a number of targeted hits, particularly at senior police officials who are investigating organized crime. For example, Lieutenant Colonel Shalkanier, a senior investigating officer of the Western Cape Anti-Gang Unit, was assassinated outside his home in September last year. He was investigating a guns to gang scandal involving the Central Firearms Registry in the police, and which may have incriminated other senior police officials. According to additional reports, he was also involved in investigating an international gold and diamond smuggling syndicate. Also then, 6 months prior to that, Lieutenant Colonel Leroy Bruvier, who was an organized crime investigator looking at rhino poaching syndicates, was targeted on his way to work by either one or a number of gunmen armed with high-powered weapons. So in South Africa in particular, these hits on senior police officials investigating organized crimes in different parts of the country highlight two things. One, that targeted hits are an integral part of organized crime. And second, the difficulty with abating it is its ability to span cities, provinces, and nations and infiltrate multiple sectors of society.
Thank you, Rukhsana. To know more about the work of the Observatory, please go to our website and have access to all the publications, podcasts, and inclusively the story of Chalkina. The growing power and dominance of organized crime is a matter of life and death, and one that demands international and regional cooperation to be solved. People are getting killed for standing up against organized crime. It's time for the world to pay attention. Join the campaign, Stop the Killing.